Hey everybody, listen, the video that you are about to watch was actually a video that was recorded, cut, and produced, ready to go before the war in Israel took place on October the 7th. Now, the subject of the video deals with what's happening with cash right now in the United States of America and the fact that we're rapidly headed towards a cashless society. And I just thought I would let you know about that because it feels eerily prophetic in many ways. And I just really hope you guys will enjoy the video. It's about a 22-minute video. And like I said, literally, we were going to release this video the day after October the 7th. That was October the 8th. And as you know, when things like what happened on October the 7th take place, we stop everything and focus in a different direction. And that's what we did. So this is that video that was going to play the day after. We hope you guys will enjoy it. Hope you'll be blessed by it and edified. There's a lot here. So with that, let's let the intro roll. The people of the United States of America have abandoned biblical principles, and as a result, God is judging the nation. The way he's doing it is by giving us a totalitarian regime that continues to speak lies concerning many aspects of life as we know it, and one of those aspects is the condition of our economy. This is what you need to know and understand. We're not fixing it until we repent. Let's talk about what's happening here in the United States of America because it does bear an effect on what will happen in the rest of the world. Moody's right now is actually saying that the United States credit rating is going to go down if there is a shutdown, right? And what they're going to basically say, a government shutdown, and what they say, and this is their quote, it will underscore the weakness of U.S. institutional and governance strength. So this is funny because when you start looking at other sovereign nations that have a Moody's AAA rating, and you begin to compare them to the declining condition of the United States of America, then there will be a movement that will be strengthened, like the movement that has already started, but that movement will strengthen to actually diminish the value of the United States dollar. By the way, the value of the United States dollar has gone down substantially because of the insane inflation that we've actually been seeing, and the inflation that we've been seeing has been coming on two fronts, right? It's been happening, of course, with respect to the GDP and how things have happened, right? The consumables have gone up substantially. Now, the White House will lie to you. And they have been lying to you because they are nothing but just a bunch of low-life liars. And what they're actually telling you in the White House is they're saying, well, the kind of inflation that we've been experiencing is relatively inconsequential because the percentages that we have been observing have nothing to do with the type of percentages that could radically or dramatically affect the condition of the world as we know it or Americans. And what they say is they say the percentage rates are at a level that are not nearly as consequential or record-breaking. And I'll give you a great example of this. They'll say, well, the kind of inflation that we're seeing right now is roughly 7% on average, when in reality, in some cases, we're talking about 40%. Now, some people say, well, James, how is it that they can get away with sharing such a large discrepancy, right? Like, how can they say that our levels of inflation have gone up only a small amount when they've really gone up through the roof? Well, they've changed the rules. I'll give you an example of this. They've been doing this like crazy. They've been lying and moving the definitions so that they can actually make certain assertions. And this is indicative of the type of thing that we should be expecting in the last days, by the way. So let me tell you exactly what's happening here, okay? When it came to us entering into a time of significant economic distress, nobody wanted to call it anything. They didn't want to give it any kind of a name. As a matter of fact, this current regime in office wanted to basically call it a little bit of a lull. They didn't want to call it recession. They did not want to call it depressionary level, which, by the way, let me just tell you, when the Great Depression happened and those bank runs were taking place, in the early 1900s, there was a lot less going on in the market with respect to inflation and many other variables that contributed to those bank runs that created the Great Depression. I just want everybody to understand that. We've seen a far more severe level of inflation, record levels of inflation. So how do they get away with doing it? Well, it's really simple. If I am the current totalitarian with my regime ruling office, making statements about what's going on with respect to the economy, and I want to be able to sound convincing to people and not be fact-checked or called a liar, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the definition of what a recession is. And that's exactly what they did. They basically said, well, in order for there to be a recession, then this is the criteria that needs to take place. And in essence, they raised the threshold substantially so that the conditions that would normally be labeled as a recession or depression for that matter have not yet been met, so that they can continue to say all is well, because they're liars and they love the devil, which is the father of lies, their own father. When we talk about what they used to use as a determining variable with respect to an index, they used to use things like milk, eggs, cheese, things like that. That's what they used. So when you actually had to sit down and you actually had to look at what was the cause of inflation, you would look at the items that people would normally buy, things that they would actually depend on, right? Very important item here. You can't just simply say that there is no inflation when things are going through the roof. That wouldn't work, not to anybody. So what do? Look what happens, right? Think about this. This is very, very important. They basically say, before we make a statement about inflation in our country, what we're going to do is change the definition of how we determine inflationary items so that we can change our index. So the index that used to determine inflation, which still does, it actually had items in there like eggs, cheese, milk, diapers, things like that. Now they have things like aluminum aircraft grade steel. Now they put things in that index that are so under little demand that in essence, what happens is that the percentage rates that relate to the inflationary mechanisms that drive those prices, they don't affect those items as much. So when eggs are going up 40%, and when real estate prices are going up, in some cases 100+%, and when gas is going up 300% in some markets, they're not using those items to be the determining variables for how inflation is determined. They're now taking things like rare wood that nobody asks for and the type of things where there is no demand. And if there is no demand because of the complexities associated with the difficulties of obtaining those items, then what in essence they do is they basically say, we don't need it, we don't buy it, the prices don't go up, it's not affected by inflation, right? Think about that for a moment. So people don't want to buy aircraft grade aluminum. People are not looking for rivets that can go into one very specific item and it can only be used for one purpose. People are not looking for a, spaceship faucet. So those prices are not going up. As a matter of fact, in some cases, some of those prices are going down. So what do? They go back and they change the items in the index to items that are not nearly going as high. So while the real inflation rates are in the neighborhood of 30, 40, 50% in some cases, the White House is saying that's misinformation, that's a lie, that's false information. We're going by the same index, and the price index that we're seeing, particularly the consumer price index, is now misreporting what's really happening because the items that you would oftentimes see stipulated from within that index have been completely changed. So what's really happening right now is that inflation is going through the roof. Remember? You went to go buy eggs. Folks, what used to be a few dollars for a dozen eggs in some markets is $8 or $9. When you start looking at the price of cheese and milk and so many of these other things, the value of your dollar has diminished substantially. So inflation is taking place as a result of that. But then it's taking place for one other reason. And this one is the scarier one. This one is the one that's a lot more significant, by the way. This is the one that just bothers me to absolutely no avail. This is the one that really concerns me, right? Because the rate of inflation that's taking place has been a problem in this country. But the greatest contributory variable has something to do with an interesting situation happening in Russia. Okay? So this is what happens, right? Think about this. And I want you to develop this in your mind. We go to Russia back in the Gorbachev days, and we tell Russia, if you do what we're asking you to do, and you break up the Soviet Union, and you cooperate with us in seeking to put together this type of treaty, for lack of a better term, then what we will do for you, Russia, is we will make you a certain set of guarantees that NATO will not expand into Ukraine or other areas that may potentially affect your security. Gorbachev says, okay, the walls in Europe come down, all kinds of things begin to happen, and almost immediately, what does the United States of America do with a few allies? They push for the expansion of NATO. And not only do they push for the expansion of NATO, they start a movement that begins to chip away at the sovereignty of Russia via proxy war. So now we hit the fast forward button, and you see dirtbags like Lady Graham and a few other of these hardcore liar Republicans that are just as evil in many cases as the Democrats, who basically say, hey, listen, we need to deal with Putin. We need to take him out. Oh, and by the way, we need to expand into Ukraine, and we need to give Ukraine lots of money, and we need to help Ukraine defeat Russia. They all know for a fact that Ukraine doesn't have a chance in defeating Russia. We all know that. Everybody that knows anything about Russia knows that Russia is going to walk all over Ukraine. Some people say that the amount of death that's happening right now in Ukraine is 15-1. Okay, we're quickly approaching the 1 million lives lost in Ukraine. And yet the United States of America has given Ukraine double the amount of money that was represented by Russia's whole defense budget in the past year, and we still are getting our rears kicked. So let me back up. We began to push other nations to yield to the idea of a NATO expansion that actually begins to affect Russia's sovereign control over a majority of their security assets. And not just their security assets, but also the assets that they control that keep the shipment of goods and services into the country. Specifically, as we look at Crimea and some of the areas that surround that. So Russia begins to see what's going on, and they begin to make a slight pivot where they realize that nobody in the international community is acting in good faith, at least the international community that's associated with NATO. And he does what he's being forced to do. Let me tell you, let me summarize this for you, okay? The United States of America pushed Russia into Ukraine, and now the United States of America is paying Ukraine a poop load of money to keep running its citizens into the meat grinder in hopes of weakening Russia's position because they are fighting a proxy war using innocent Ukrainians to want to affect something going on with Russia. Why? Because Putin has finally signaled that he is fully aware of and understands and is developing an attack plan on American clandestine operations that have existed in Ukraine prior to World War II. So let's get this straight. We push Russia into invading, as they would call it, Ukraine. And now we are seeking to penalize Russia for what they did. And that brings us to the second contributory variable to the inflation that we're seeing and the problems with the weakening US dollar. What we do is, in essence, after we affect that cause, we then say, Putin, we're going to sanction you. And the way we're going to sanction you is we're going to take away all of your money, which a substantial portion of his wealth is liquidated in the form of the US dollar. So what does Putin say? Putin says, hey, no problem. There's one variable you all forgot. And the variable you forgot is the fact that your own president, yes, President Biden, gave me full control to complete the Nord Stream pipeline, Nord Stream 2 specifically. And quite frankly, nobody has, when I say nobody could anticipate what would happen, number one. But he says, nobody in Western Europe, or Eastern Europe for that matter, will have access to my energy resources if you're going to keep this nonsense up. Uh-oh, now we have a problem. So then Putin goes to the international community, specifically those that are on the European continent, and he says, well, I got all this energy stuff that I can give you. And by the way, this energy stuff is what you need. I've got the gas you need, the natural gas. I've got the petroleum you need. I got everything that you need to be able to sustain yourself because you're going into a very, very cold winter. But then he says this. Ready? He says, I'm going to charge you a little bit more. My production levels are going to have to go down because of what you're doing to me. You're putting me in a very difficult position, and I'm not doing it despite you. I'm doing it because you've put me in a very difficult position, and all my resources are being spent defending my country. So the Europeans are like, okay, well, we kind of expected some of this to happen. This is going to hurt. It's not going to be good. And then he lays the bomb on them. He says, oh, yeah, by the way, you can no longer buy my energy resources with the United States dollar, which, by the way, the United States dollar had the buying power everywhere. It was the gold standard everywhere. Now he just peed all over the United States dollar and in essence said, the only way you can buy oil from me is through the ruble. So what do they have to do? They have to start exchanging. That's exactly what has to happen. And in the process, the value of the US dollar has gone down and down and down and down and down and down. And now we're looking at articles like Moody's saying that if there's a government shutdown, the United States is not going to be able to hold up to other AAA rated sovereignties. This is important, right? Because Moody's is the last of the three major agencies that give credit ratings to sovereign nations. That's a very important thing. But there are other agencies that have already downgraded the United States' credit rating. We have to understand that. It's really, really important. Fitch downgraded the United States to a AA plus rating from a AAA rating. That happened earlier this year, right? And now we're beginning to see these indicators from Moody that they're about to do the same thing. And if they're about to do the same thing, nobody is going to want to deal with U.S. currency. And if nobody wants to deal with U.S. currency, I don't care what you say. You could say BRICS will work out or whatever will work out. It's not going to happen. As a matter of fact, let me just say this. I want to make myself very, very clear. As a matter of fact, it's going to destroy currency as a whole. There will not be cash in our society after the US dollar is actually completely destroyed. They are working hard to do it. They want to do it. They don't care about anybody else in the context of doing it. And that's the farm that they're actually buying. And I think that this is a very important issue to bring out to the table. It's very, very important that we see this. That's exactly what they want to do. How about this when you start looking at the domestic condition of our finances? We know we're well on the way to the US dollar going bye-bye. When the US dollar goes bye-bye, we're well on our way to going to a cashless society. That's really where we're going right now. We are in the midst of going down a cashless society road, which when we get into Revelation 13, we should expect that to happen. Because how are you going to enforce the buy or sell of anything if you are not utilizing a system that's cashless? It's really simple. The Federal Reserve is making a forecast concerning interest rates by hiking those interest rates, and the financial markets are basically saying, we don't respect you, Fed, which has never happened before, and they're actually betting against the position of the Fed. That's a big deal, by the way. They're talking about more interest rate hikes now, and eventually they'll cut down the interest rate next year. By the way, why are they interest rate hiking? They're interest rate hiking because as inflation is increasing out of control, when you increase the interest rates, you manage to slow down the inflation, because as the cost of money goes higher, people stop spending money because they can't afford to be able to pay for the cost of their borrowing. This is pretty important for us, because if the market is fighting the Fed right now, then that means the Fed has effectively lost their control to regulate the fiat currency that is known as the US dollar, in order to be able to maintain a semblance of order with respect to keeping rapid inflation from taking place. That's going to all go bye-bye. And now the interest rates that they raise, the only time those will be affected is within the context of the T-bills that are already being sold for pennies on the dollar. It's kind of a big deal if you think about it, right? Higher yields, inflation is not going to fall. The market is ignoring it. The Fed is beginning to lose its credibility in substantial ways, right? And now we're beginning to see an influx of people who their very actions cause the value of the US dollar to go bye-bye, because the way that they live in this country is based on a bartering system, which also dramatically affects how we look at things like consumption in this country, and the demand with respect to the economic principle, the issue how demand controls things, now goes bye-bye. That means when things start to bleed, they're going to bleed and there won't be any stopping it.